Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to another session of Karwan Online History Festival Season 2. Today I am joined by a special guest, special scholar because he is the one behind my understanding of the British India, the history of British India because I have attended his lectures online. Professor Vinay Lal is a professor of history, and Asian American studies at UCLA. He writes widely on the history and culture of colonial and modern India, popular and public culture in India, especially cinema, historiography and the politics of words history, the Indian diaspora, global politics, contemporary American politics, the life and thought of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Hinduism, and the politics of knowledge systems. Professor Lal is the author of and editor of 15 books, and currently he's working on a book on the novel coronavirus, which will be published later next month by Pan Macmillan. And at present, he's a frequent contributor to the Indian Express and the Economic and Political Weekly Mumbai. So it's a truly an honor to have Professor Lal with us this evening for him. Welcome to the session, sir, and over to you.
Thank you, Ishan, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Good morning to all of you in Delhi and elsewhere in India, and greetings to everyone else. So, this talk today is called Catastrophic Death, Plague, Pestilence, and Famine in Late Colonial India. But I should say right at the outset that the portion on famine is really very minimal, because I'm really going to be speaking about epidemic death for the most part. But you'll see why towards the end, why a discussion of famine is also, I think, quite important. For those of you who've been keeping up with what's been happening, obviously with migrant laborers in India, you know that one of the issues once the first phase of the lockdown was imposed by the Prime Minister on March 24th, 25th, one of the issues that arose immediately was the question of how are we going to feed all of these people? I mean, the government that you would have such a large number of people who would be on the move. I'm going to speak about that later on. But then the question is, when they were on the move, how are they going to be fed? And the International Labour Organization and the WHO, both UN organizations, have suggested that hunger is going to be quite possibly a major global issue arising out of the present pandemic. So there is a relationship between even the pandemic and issues of famine and hunger, starvation. But this is going to be, with respect to what I'm going to speak about, it's going to be not central to the argument for the most part, but there is a larger argument where I'm going to bring in the issue of famine, but largely I'm going to be confined to the question of epidemic death, plagues, and so on. But by way of a preface, let me first begin with some other kinds of observations first, all right? And I want to say that it is quite obvious that this presentation has been prompted by what has obviously transpired in the last several months, since the coronavirus became the only topic of conversation in many ways. And since the virus set out to, if I may put it this way, conquer the world. I would have been happy to speak about the coronavirus and my understanding of some of the socio-cultural, political, ethical, and philosophical issues that arise out of a consideration of the pandemic. But Ishan, who had invited me, and perhaps the people he works with, were keen on having a historical perspective as well. So I'm not really going to speak about the coronavirus pandemic, but I'm happy to entertain questions about it after my talk is over, and there will be occasions in between when I will be referring to it, because there are many things, such as, for example, the Epidemic Diseases Act of February 1897, which the Indian government, through an ordinance, has now put into effect once again. So this is a piece of legislation that goes back almost 125 years to the colonial period. And the context in which it arose is something that I'm going to be discussing at much greater length shortly. I'm also, of course, happy to provide that historical perspective, because that's what my calling is, at least officially, as a historian. And I am finishing up a small book, which should be published by late next month, on the coronavirus pandemic. It's a real challenge to do something like that, because the terrain is shifting every day, literally, as it were. Secondly, I want to add a personal note. The personal note is that I've been speaking to my mother every day, occasionally twice a day, from the United States. She lives in Gurgaon. She's in her late 80s. And one of the subjects of our conversation, of course, has been the pandemic. And there's obviously concern on my part, because she's not able to go anywhere, and I'm not able to go there. And she's in her late 80s. I need not spell out the implications of that, But the reason I mention this is simply this, that since we've been talking about it, for the first time, I mean, I'm almost 60 years old, so I've had many conversations with her about her past, about the family and all of that. But for the first time, 2 months ago, I heard from her that 3 of my great aunts, that is, 3 sisters of my maternal grandfather, had died of the plague about 1900. I never heard this before from her. I mean, I've sort of quizzed her. I've sat down with her a number of times. I've done a little, by the way, of what you might call oral history, recording conversations with her, trying to understand not only her past and what it was like for her to grow up, to be born in pre 1947 India, but also to recall my own childhood. So we have had extensive conversations, but I had never heard this from her before. And she just dropped this, and she said she had never recalled it. So this is one of the things, of course, were a subject for interrogation for everyone, is the and how that plays into our understanding of not only what's happening now, but into our understanding of events going back to the late 1890s and the first half of the 20th century in colonial India. And thirdly, by way of a preface, before I launch into some more formal substantive remarks, I think I must confess, and I do so without any hesitation, that I think that I was insufficiently attentive to the question of epidemic disease in my own study and in the teaching of Indian history. Now, I've taught Indian history for close to 3 decades. I also teach a course at UCLA on contemporary world history, which is a period from industrial civilization down to the present day. And in those lectures, I have talked a little bit about the so-called Spanish flu. I'm going to speak about it in much greater length in just a few minutes. But the Spanish influenza, or the Spanish flu of 1918-20, I have mentioned that, but more or less in passing, because what is really quite striking to me now is that once COVID-19 became a disease that entered into the pores of society everywhere in the world, that suddenly we all became much more attentive to the whole question of epidemic disease, the place of plague. Yes, I mean, those who are somewhat read and somewhat literate and educated would have heard of the Black Death before, but how many of us had really read about it in any detail, unless you happen to be working on the 14th century in Europe, right? Um, and I say this because I think that one of the things that this present set of circumstances has done is it's made us aware of a certain sets of issues which I don't think that historians of India have been sufficiently attentive to. I'm well aware of the fact that there are people who are specialized in the study of epidemic disease, and in the case of India, there are 2 or 3 people who come to mind, but that's a very small number when you think of the enormity of the issues that we're speaking about. And the specialists I'm talking about, I mean, are people like Ira Klein and I.J. Katanak. David Arnold, of course, has written on much of this, but he's written on a wide array of subjects, and he's probably the only person in what was known as the subaltern school of Indian history who really did talk about these kinds of issues. Although I think this is a slightly later phase of his work, right? But anyhow, I mentioned this only because I think it is interesting to what extent I think this has not really entered into what I might call the more general histories that we have of India. And as you'll see very shortly, this is a question that is germane to the understanding of world history as well. So I want to work my way backwards. I mean, the period I'm interested in fundamentally is about late 1860s to 1920. There will be some reference to the Bengal famine, but only very, very peripherally, the Bengal famine of 1943. But that's really the period I want to work with, because that's a period when we can think about the relationship between epidemic disease, between diseases that are endemic in India at that time, which included smallpox. As many of you are aware, smallpox was not eradicated until, in fact, about 1980. That has been unquestionably the most successful campaign waged by the WHO, by the World Health Organization. Polio is a close second, although polio is not fully eradicated. It is eradicated from India now, but it's not fully eradicated from Nigeria and Pakistan and a couple of other places where it has surfaced in very recent years, right? So the period I'm interested in is when you have endemic disease and epidemic disease and famine. And I should put this out straight away. I mean, it didn't really occur to me until I really started looking into these questions very seriously about 3 months ago. And this is not to say that I hadn't read about famines, especially famine literature I've been familiar with for a long period of time. A PhD student of mine actually finished a doctoral dissertation about 10, 12 years ago on famines in colonial India, and one portion of it was dedicated to the question of famine photography, and you're going to see some photographs, later on in this presentation. All right, but what is really striking to my mind, and this is what I mean when I want to put this out before, I want to suggest to you that we are speaking about an excess mortality of approximately, to give a round figure, a clean round figure, if I may put it this way, an excess mortality of close to 100 million lives between 1870 and 1920. What I mean by that, what I mean by excess mortality, very simply is this. So, for example, let's take the coronavirus right now. So, in New York, for example, at the height of it, okay, in late March and through the month of April, you had about 700-800 people dying in New York City every day. In the United States, the peak was about 3,000 deaths every day. Of course, the number of infections is much higher today than it was back then. All right. So we may get a different peak with respect to mortality, who knows, in the weeks ahead. But what I mean by excess mortality very simply is that if you say that, let's say on March 30th in 2020, you had 3,800 deaths, okay? And March 2019 and 2018 and 2017, so take, let's say, 5 years in the past, you had 800 deaths on the average each year. Because you would have a certain number of deaths in any case every day, from whether it's from coronary disease or just old age or diabetes or pneumonia, whatever the case may be. And I'm just giving a random set of number here, okay? So in this case, the excess mortality would be 3,000. If it was only 800 before in the preceding, on the average, preceding 4 or 5 years. And so what we're saying is that so many number of people in India would die every year from this period of 1870 to 1920 on account of old age and account of natural death, if I may put it this way. But then if we're looking at excess mortality, we're speaking about death from famine, epidemic disease, cholera, tuberculosis. Right? That's what we're speaking about. And I'm suggesting to you that the number of 100 million, which is absolutely astronomical, is, I think, not at all an exaggerated number. All right. Now, let me work my way backwards. I want to first look at 1918-20 to what is called the Spanish influenza, the so-called Spanish flu, which has nothing to do with Spain. Let me just mention that right at the outset. We should always ask, what's in a name? What's the politics of a name? When Trump calls the virus the Wuhan virus or the China virus, or he's even called it the Kung flu, he's diabolically clever at these kinds of things, of course, right? That has implications. For example, in the US, one of the implications, not that only his calling it created this set of circumstances, but one of the implications certainly is that there's been a enormous rise in attacks against the Chinese, what are called hate crimes, Chinese Americans in the United States. So this Spanish flu had nothing to do with Spain at all. It did not originate in Spain. In fact, it's not certain where it originated, but now the most recent scholarly work in the last 20 years seems to suggest it was an army camp in Kansas, in the United States, in Kansas, from where it actually probably then started migrating, as it were. All right. So why is it called the Spanish flu? It's called the Spanish flu because Spain was neutral in World War I. And as happens in every war, there is propaganda on both sides. I don't think I need to again spell it out. You can see very clearly that if you look at, for example, what China and the United States have said, about the origins of this, the Chinese have. This was after the Americans had put out the theory that it might have come out of a biological, lab. It might have been created as a form of biological warfare. And I'm not saying that every American subscribed to it, but that's one theory that was put out. And so the Chinese, in fact, actually argue that it was the Americans who had originated it. So that's what I mean, that, in a war, there will be propaganda on both sides. And it was understood that the most reliable information coming about the Spanish influenza was most likely coming out of Spain, which was neutral. So it became identified, the information became identified with Spain, and it became known as the Spanish flu. Now, it has also, until quite recently, and this is a phenomenally interesting question that I'm going to want you to keep in mind throughout. Okay? And that is, it has also been known as the forgotten pandemic. Alfred Crosby, perhaps most famous for his book on the Columbian Exchange, what he was referring to by the Columbian Exchange was what happened when the Europeans arrived in the Americas. And that they brought a whole bunch of old world diseases to the New World, which included smallpox and chickenpox, malaria, tuberculosis, typhus, bubonic plague, influenza. All of these were brought from the old world to the New World. From the New World, what went to Europe was syphilis, That's a different story. It's outside the purview of my remarks today, but that's the Columbian Exchange fundamentally that we're really talking about. Now, he also wrote a book, Alfred Crosby also wrote a book, which is called America's Forgotten Pandemic, The Influence of 1918, published by Cambridge University Press. But he's not the only one who has referred to it in these terms. And when he was referring to it as a forgotten pandemic, of course, we have to ask, why was it forgotten? Was it really forgotten? It couldn't have been forgotten because of the low mortality. And incidentally, by the way, pandemic is not necessarily, when we characterize an epidemic as a pandemic, it is not a necessary reference to mortality rates. This is a mistaken view. The H1n1 pandemic of 2009, officially declared a pandemic by WHO, only caused about 9,000 deaths. That's very small. I mean, number of people who die from ordinary flu would be greater. It has to do with the extent, with the geographical extent. Sometimes, of course, the intensification of it may factor into the definition of a pandemic as well. Okay, but in the 1918 pandemic, which lasted until 1920, was estimated by demographers at that time. So I'm talking about research done in 1921-22. And remember that in India itself, you have a census every 10 years, and the first census after 1918 was 1921, because the previous census was 1911, and then 1931, 1941, and so on. All right? And in the United States, similarly, you have a census every 10 years. Now, in the census reports from most countries, which is one way in which you gather the information, at that time suggested, and of course there was data coming from hospitals and from numerous other sources, casualties of about 22 million. That figure has now been revised upwards in the last 2 decades to 50 to 100 million fatalities. Okay, that's a number of people who are estimated to have died from the Spanish influenza. I mean, this is a staggering number. I think all of you would agree. In the United States alone, it killed about 675,000 people. Remember that the number of Americans who were killed in World War I was 116,500. So we're talking about 20% only of the number of people who were killed in the pandemic. The war was not forgotten. All you have to do is read histories of the United States in the 20th century, and you'll certainly see, even though the United States entered that war very late, of course, it only entered the war in 1917, and 1 year before the war terminated. But the critical thing here is that the question that we want to keep on thinking about is, why was that pandemic forgotten? Read Norman Lowe's huge textbook, which has been used widely on world history in the 20th century. It is not even mentioned, actually. It is not even mentioned in that work at all, right? It is also puzzling why historical scholarship barely broaches the subject of the course of this Spanish influenza. I'm just going to call it the influenza of 1918 from now in India. No country suffered as much as did India. Right? We're talking about roughly 15 to 18 million people who are estimated to have been killed by the influenza in 1918 influenza in India. And when I give these figures, incidentally, I should make it very clear, when I give figures also for famines later on, what we're really speaking about is fatality rates and mortality figures we're talking about from British India. So if you add the native states, then we're possibly speaking of the upwards of 18, 20, 21 million. If you leave the native states out, then we're speaking about somewhere between 13 to 16, 17 million. All right. The number of people killed in India was twice as many killed in any other country. And the few accounts that we have because we have very, very few accounts of the 1918 influenza talk about streets littered with corpses and droves of people moving from one house to another in search of food. There is a recent book that has been written by Laura Spinney, which is somewhat attentive to what happened in India. She has almost a chapter there. But most of the works that have been written on the influenza of 1918 have not really talked about what happened in India. And to the best of my knowledge, there is still not a single book dedicated entirely to this subject when you consider the number of people who are killed. Once again, we're speaking about somewhere in the vicinity of 14 to 20 million. So this is the question to which I shall return later. Why is it that the influenza of 1918 was forgotten? That it was forgotten, I said to you, cannot be doubted. So if you look at, for example, colonial India, and particularly if you're looking at the 20th century, if you're looking at 20th century, even when they had a law and order problem, as the British called it, which caused 10, 15, 20 deaths, 10, 20, 30 deaths, or 500 deaths, what did the British do? They would immediately appoint a committee of inquiry, a commission, right? I happened to write my doctoral dissertation 30 years ago on law and order commissions and this form of governmentality in British India. Now, when something this catastrophic happens, there is no commission. There is nothing of that kind, not even a committee report on what happened in 1918, 1919, 1920, even though this was their favored mode of governmentality, this idea of the committee report or the report of the commission. Now, by contrast, when bubonic plague struck India in 1896, and it lingered on for many years. So when I refer to the bubonic plague of 1896, it's a shorthand for the plague that started in 1896 and lingered on until about 1910. I mean, it really reduced in intensity, by early 1898, but there were still deaths here and there, and it lingered on for about 10 or 12 years. Okay. When this happened in 1898-99, the British produced what is called the Indian Plague Commission Report. It's in 5 volumes, about 3,000 pages, huge amounts of material. The first 4 volumes are volumes of evidence where they interview and talk to hundreds of people, government officials, Indian public figures, common people, and so on, right? And volume 5 is the voluminous report of the Plague Commission, but we don't have anything even remotely resembling this for 1918-20, even though the mortality figures for 1918-20 are greater than they are for the bubonic plague, which itself killed somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 12 million. All right? Okay. For 1896, again, for the bubonic plague or the Bombay plague of 1896, we have a photographic record. Okay, we have a photographic record. We'll turn to that in just about 10 minutes or so, just a small portions of it. But we don't have any photographs at all. I think there are only about 1 or 2 existing photographs, more or less, of 1918, 1920, the consequences of the influenza. All right. If you look at the work of Chris Spinney, who in my judgment, has done the most interesting work on photography in colonial India, I mean, even he doesn't have anything to say really about any of this. All right. Okay. So now let me work my way backwards. Let me give you a few more details, and then I'm going to go back to that question because that question has enormously interesting implications. Why was the pandemic of 1918 to 20 forgotten? Okay. If you work your way backwards from the influence of 1918, so how did the influence of 1918 come to India? It most likely from the sea via Bombay, via ports. There are some newspaper accounts of this. Again, not very many. There are some newspaper accounts. For those of you who are history students or faculty, the Times of India had coverage of this. It had very extensive coverage of 1896, much more extensive of 1896, and all of that is available on ProQuest. So you can access this, and think I've seen almost all the newspaper articles that may have come out on the 1918, 1920, as well as on the 1896, plague as well. So in 1918, it spreads from Bombay, from the west, and then the south to north and east. The initial wave was less ferocious, a milder strain of the virus. The second wave sees the peak in September 1918. So it first comes in Bombay about June 1918. Although the first time they ever talk about it formally is in late September 1918. And then Madras about mid-October, and then Calcutta, it's reached there and starts to peak there, the first wave in mid-November, late November 1918. You have voluntary organizations like the Ramakrishna Mission and the Social Service League, also a number of organizations in places like Pune, which took over the work of supplying food and medicine. There is very little evidence of the Indian state doing anything at all at this time in 1918, 1919. Now, David Arnold says, and I quote here, the plague threatened Europe from Asia. The flu spread in the opposite direction from Europe to India. So he's comparing the 1896 to the 1918. After the first plague years, a chastened government was always reluctant about enforcing compulsory measures on the Indian public. So here is referring to the 1896. Now that gives you some indication of why there might have been no state intervention in 1918, 1919. Believing them counterproductive, he says these measures, and instead look to voluntary measures, including greater reliance on home seclusion and a role for Ayurvedic and Unani practitioners. All right. Now this will become a bit more intelligible to you when shortly I go to the 1896 bubonic plague. What we can also say about 1918 is that social distancing was recognized in India as elsewhere as something that could greatly mitigate the effects of the influenza epidemic. By the way, they don't use the phrase social distancing at that time. They do talk about distancing, and they talk about isolation and quarantine and shutting down things. The most interesting example of that, so here I'm moving outside the Indian context, but just to give you some indication of the fact that the idea of social distancing was in fact actually very much prevalent, and was part of the awareness of what needs to be done in 1918 globally. So the most famous illustration that has been given very recently, and there have been lots of reports about that. Of course, this is more from the American sort of point of view. But the most famous illustration is the comparison between two cities, both of which were rather more important at that time than they are today. I mean, not that they're inconsequential cities today, but they were 1918. And here I'm speaking about the cities of St. Louis and Philadelphia. And in St. Louis, the mayor of that city decided that he would shut down everything. So nightclubs, bars, cabaret halls, schools, churches, assembly halls, all of that. All right. All of this was completely shut down. The mayor of Philadelphia decided that he wasn't going to observe anything of that kind. And at the peak, the fatality rate in Philadelphia was 5 times higher than it was in St. Louis, right? So there is a scholar who has worked on it, an Indian scholar actually, who teaches at Michigan State University, who has worked on the 1918 influenza pandemic. And he says, this is Siddharth Chandra, he says, social distancing has been repeatedly recognized as an important way to reduce the impact of the previous epidemics, including the 1918 influenza pandemic. The aim is to dampen the wave of deaths. The dampen the waves is that you lower the height of the peak and you stretch the length of the wave. And one of the reasons you want to stretch it is so that it doesn't put enormous pressure on medical services, right? So if too many people are rushing to the hospital all at the same time, then obviously the hospitals will run out of ICUs, beds, ventilators, supplies, and so forth, right? So you stretch it out if you can, right? And that's what it means to dampen it, right? Um, so what he's suggesting is that this was actually quite well known in 1918, and there is reason to believe that this was observed in India to some degree as well. Now he furnishes some other reasons for why the pandemic weakened as it moved eastward to Calcutta, but I don't want to really get into that because I want to look at what happens in 1896, make that comparison between 1896 and 1918. Once again, keeping in mind that when I speak of 1896, I'm referring to, not just what happened in that year, but in subsequent years as well, which were part of the Bombay or Bubonic Plague. And when I speak of 1918, I'm referring to the period from 1918 to 1920. One of the most striking things, particularly from the vantage point of today, where we know that the coronavirus has accounted for a disproportionately large number of elderly among its victims, right? To a very substantially, the victims are from a elderly age group, okay? In 1918, the group of people who were most affected was between 20 and 40. There has been some speculation. I mean, we don't really know that much about it, but there's been some speculation that it spread very quickly in the army. Remember that World War I is still going on when the pandemic breaks out in 1918, and that, in the trenches and in, close quarters, soldiers got infected much more rapidly. But we don't really have a complete exhaustive account of why it was relatively the younger group that was affected. Now let me move backwards, as I said, to the bubonic plague of 1896. Okay, but keep in mind that if you look at what's happening in 1918, that one might suppose that the colonial state had abdicated its duties of furnishing at least a rudimentary public health infrastructure. And to some degree, that is unquestionably true. But I want to suggest to you that the picture may be somewhat more complicated. Okay. Now, here, as I've already indicated, so I won't rehearse the details, the death toll is immense. We're speaking about 10 to 12 million. And in contrast to 1918-20, this plague is much better documented than the 1918 pandemic. We also have a photographic record, and this photographic record has been preserved. The archive has been preserved largely by the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine in London. And we have obviously the 5 volumes of the Plague Commission report. There are also, by the way, supplementary volumes in another commission, which sits several years later. And this commission was extremely diligent in recording, as were other colonial officials, even those who were not part of the commission's, who didn't come under the purview of the commission, that other colonial officials had all diligent in recording details about it. So where did this plague come from? There was an intense discussion at that time. To cut that discussion short, it's almost certainly the case that there are 2 competing theories, and it's almost certainly the case that it comes from one of these 2 sources. One is that it comes into Bombay via soldiers, or via which is not, the soldiers here is really people coming in from it could have been merchants, it could have been other people, traders coming into Bombay. The other argument is that, the southern slopes of the Himalayas had always been prone to sort of epidemic diseases, and it may have come there, because in the plains, there had been no epidemic disease for at least 50 years at that point in time. Okay. Now, what were the measures that were taken? This is enormously interesting. We know about all of this from the report of the Indian Plague Commission. All right, but before I get into the measures, one of the most striking things is you have a massive exodus of people. When the coronavirus, when I say massive exodus people, I'm talking about one half of the population of Bombay left. The city was emptied out. Okay. This is not something, by the way, that is something that happens only in India. You might be thinking about the migrant laborers that you've all, read about after the prime minister imposed a lockdown, and then within days you had, graphic, horrifying images of hundreds of thousands of, millions of migrant laborers who all obviously wanted to leave because they had no shelter, they had no food, they didn't have any jobs. And for those of Indian conditions, that if you're working at a construction site, you often sleep on the construction site. So if the owner of that place where construction is being done locks the gates, effectively it means that you don't even have a place to sleep anymore. All right. And so, but again, we're not going to get into the details of what really happened in India in late March and in April. But what I'm saying simply is that if there were people in this government who had the habit of reading a little bit and thinking and reflecting, they would have understood that this is going to happen, because this has happened time after time. It happened in the Black Death in the 14th century, massive exodus of people. All right. And certainly in 1896, half the city, all the sources agree on that. Even in the newspapers, we talk about it, just left. Within days, the city had been really emptied out. What is interesting, which is not mentioned, okay, and Natasha Sarkar, who has written a doctoral dissertation, is really the first one who really looks at it in some detail, is that there is a bit of an irony there. Well, the problem here is that one reason why the cities expanded as they did in India already in the late 19th century, this was happening. This would, of course, happen in the post-47 period, when Delhi, which 1941 census had a population of 400,000 and today has 21 million, that you have a massive expansion of cities in India, okay, post-47 period. And if, for those of you interested in the commercial Hindi film, you know that this scene of the migrant, the person who, comes into the city to look for work, was a perennial theme in the 50s, 60s, even in the 70s, right? Now, what she points out is that even then you have people leaving. Between the months of April and June of 1897, about 250 to 300,000 people were trying to come into Bombay from the rural countryside, because the countryside was not able to sustain them. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, of course, Indian indentured laborers also left, and beginning in the late 1830s and then 1840s, going to Trinidad and Guyana and, Mauritius and so on and so forth for the next several decades, in Fiji much later on. But that's what happened, right? The evacuation of the countryside to a substantial degree, right? So she records this phenomenon. But important thing is you have this exodus. Now, the report of the commission, report of the Indian Plague Commission, describes in substantial detail, I mean, 5 volumes, you can imagine that the detail is enormous, describes in substantial detail many of the measures that were taken to try to bring it under control. And for those of you who don't have the luxury of reading, I've only read very small parts of it, but there is a very good summary of this, which was given in the British Medical Journal in 1904 over successive issues, and basically 6 or 7 issues of this journal, summarize the whole report of the Plague Commission. They talk about the measures that were taken to control the plague, and they talk about the using disinfectants, the use of dry chloride or lime to flush out passages, to flush out sewers, to clean up homes. Sometimes homes were destroyed. Clothes of those who were infected were burnt immediately. Closure of grain stores. A little footnote here. The first place where the plague appears in a village or a town when it first appears, as it spreads, is guess where? The shopkeeper, because that's where rats are likely to appear. And there's a very interesting literature which I wasn't aware of, which is the use of cats as preventive measures for plague. I mean, there are like 8 or 10 articles on that in medical journals, all of which agreed that villages that had a larger number of cats were generally free of the plague. So many of them argued that simplest way to take care of this problem was to actually make sure that each village had a supply of cats. All right. There's a very interesting article written by a man called Buchanan, which I'm going to go back to in just a minute or two, because what you see also in that piece is you see a much more detailed sociology of knowledge in colonial India. All right. And then you had quarantine and isolation, and you had search parties. So the search parties were, and this is where the Indian the Epidemic Diseases Act of February 1897 comes in. So this was an act that was passed and which was then invoked, as I said in my opening remarks a little while ago, invoked by the Indian government when it passed an ordinance in March to bring this act back into consideration. Of course, portions of it have been entirely revised. So if you look at the act now, as it appears on the internet, you can get a PDF of it. Actually, is not the act that was really published back in 1897, because it omits the portions that the government of India has deleted, and modified. But among other things, the act says, for example, very clearly, so its power to take special measures and prescribe regulations as to dangerous epidemic disease. So this is section 2. When at any time the state government is satisfied that the state or any part visited or threatened with an outbreak of dangerous epidemic disease, and it thinks that the ordinary provisions of law are insufficient, it may then take into consideration other considerations which this act empowers them to do. And that included the portion that has been retained by the ordinance of 2020, the inspection of persons traveling by railways or otherwise, and the segregation, I'm reading it out, literally, in hospital, temporary accommodation or otherwise, of persons suspected by the inspecting officer of being infected with any such disease. Now, let me translate this into a different language. Okay. In 1897, what colonial officials inferred from the act was that they had the power to undertake search parties. Okay, that generally meant 3 officials, including at least 1 British official, and they would go and escorted by a bunch of constables, and they had the authority to enter into any Indian home to see if someone there was being put in hiding, because officially you were supposed to reveal that you had the plague, as it were, that you were infected, you had the symptoms, and then you were supposed to go into quarantine or isolation. Now, the colonial state's view was that we want to ensure that there's compliance with this. So this created a huge ruckus. And it created a huge ruckus because lots of Indians argued that what the colonial state was really doing was it was using this as a pretext to enter into Indian homes, and in particular violate the privacy of their women, of the zenana, etc. So there's actually a substantial literature. There are newspaper accounts which very clearly happening. Okay, so for example, there is a newspaper called the Hitavadi, and it attacks the Epidemic Diseases Act in an article just literally days after the act was passed. It says that this act would enable executive officers on the merest suspicion to, quote, snatch away the wife from the husband, the daughter from the arms of the mother, helpless children from the side of their parents, and old parents from the protection of their sons. And for those of your students of Indian history, you're well aware of the fact that one of the consequences of this, which I'm not going to talk about really except to mention it for those who are not aware of it, that the plague commissioner in Pune, William Rand, was going to be assassinated by two brothers, the Chapekar brothers, who then, of course, become legendary figures. And this is one of the first acts of political assassination that is carried out in what we might characterize as the nationalist period, right? All right. So when we are looking at the Epidemic Diseases Act, there are obviously political implications of that kind, but the fact that this act was considered to be necessary, and that the Indian state today still is working under the purview of this act, I think is not insignificant. Although, of course, I'm sure all of you are aware that the Indian state has also summoned a number of other pieces of legislation, not only the Epidemic Diseases Act. Now, finally, on this question, but before I do that, Ishan, may I ask you to open that PowerPoint and share it, because I want to show 5 images, which are from, so we can go to the first slide after this, which are from the Wellcome Institute's collection. Okay, so these are all, by the way, from Karachi. These photographs were all taken from Karachi, which of course was part of undivided India now. And these photographs are all from 1897 from the Wellcome collection. And this shows a quarantine area. This shows a quarantine area. It doesn't, of course, people are not singularly in isolation, but this would have been a large area. And then they actually sort of got everybody together for a group photograph. Somebody would have to really sit down and analyze, the whole politics of photographs of this kind as well. But this is the quarantine area during the bubonic plague in 1890 and in 1897. If we can go to the next one now. I'm going to show them very quickly here because we don't really have time to really ponder over each of these images at any substantial length. Here you have a European, a white doctor who is injecting a curative serum in a pig patient. Again, all of these, once again, just let me reiterate, are from Karachi from 1897. And let me reiterate, we have nothing of this kind for 1918 to 20, the influenza of that period. Not a single photograph of this kind, or indeed any kind at all. All right. Okay. Next photograph. All right. So this is people who are doing their laundry at the Dhobi Ghat in Karachi, in the outskirts of Karachi, 1897. And this is all during the plague. And Karachi was quite badly hit at this time, because remember, it started in, as I said, in Bombay, and then it works its way further west and south, and then eventually north and east as well. All right, so if we could have the next image. I only selected 5 images from this. The Wellcome Institute collection has about 500 images. For those of you who want to look at that, you can easily find it by Googling it. This is what you're seeing here is a house where people who had been infected with the plague had been living, and the house was demolished. And the last image from this series over here. Okay, and this I thought was an extraordinary photograph. This is a person who is being disinfected. So he's been put in that tub, and they are spraying something. The image doesn't specify what is it, what's being used, whether it's chlorine, for example. Some of you may be aware, incidentally, that when the whole set of episodes related to migrant laborers started in late March of this year, when the coronavirus pandemic was declared. So some of you may be aware that one of the most horrifying incidents we read about, and there are number of videos on YouTube that was taken of people who were being hosed down. And again, what exactly the substance was. It wasn't water. It seems it was chlorine, but water with chlorine. But as a case may be, this whole idea of disinfecting people like that, as though you might be disinfecting an infected structure, trying to kill rats or mosquitoes or something of that kind. That's what it obviously invokes. And there are obviously resonances with what the Nazis did when they used, Zyklon B gas, for example, which was actually an insecticide. It was first created as an insecticide, and then it was used, when they decided to start gassing Jews at a number of concentration camps. So anyhow, these are the images which we'll get back to the PowerPoint presentation in just a few minutes as I move quickly to my conclusion. H1n, just let me know, because I know that it's already almost an hour into. I think it's about 50 minutes maybe since I started. How much more time do I have? Do you want me to conclude in about 10 minutes or so that we leave time for questions and answers? I can't hear you.
We can take 10 to 20 minutes, sir.
Okay, all right. Okay, so let me just take another 10-15 minutes over here. And what I want to do is I want to share with you very briefly before I move to the question of famines, and then in my conclusion, I will move back to that question, which I want to analyze at greater detail. And that question is, why is it that the pandemic of 1918-20 was forgotten? What are the implications of that, right? That it appears almost nowhere in the visual record, in the archive. There's no commission report. There's no photographic record. And there's very little scholarly work, even today, 100 years later. But before we move into all of that, so because I think that this material becomes more interesting when you start delving into the whole colonial sociology of knowledge and the colonial politics of knowledge in the characterization of the plague and the measures and the literature. What was the nature of governmentality? What was the kind of discursive formation that they were actually attempting to put into place? So there is an article written by Lieutenant Colonel A. Buchanan. It's called Cats as Plague Preventers. That's the actual title of the piece, published in the British Medical Journal on 30th May 1908. And it's a detailed discussion of something I've already hinted at, that is, why not use cats to prevent bubonic plague? And then it gives evidence from a number of different villages, a number of different districts, and points out that colonial officials actually went and made inquiries in a number of different places, and essentially they were able to establish that, as a rule, and I'm quoting, as a rule, there was no cat in the houses in which cases of plague occurred. So when plague occurs, there are no cats. And of course, the reverse is that when you do have cats, there is no plague. Now, you might think to yourself, well, this is all very simple because, for example, there are all kinds of complications that arise. One of the complications was, I don't think that the British had thought through it, and they might not have thought through it because they hadn't really tried it before. That might be one of the simplest reasons for it. But that when you disinfect a house, when you disinfect a house and you try to drive the rats out, or you try to kill them, but if you don't kill them and you drive them out, what they do is they go to another home and then they infect that home. So one of the things they came to the realization was that it wasn't good enough to just disinfect the house. And you either killed the rat or you did nothing. Because if you actually didn't kill the rat, but you disinfected it, left an odor that was unpleasant, for example, or that the cat might die of slow poisoning, and that the rat might die of slow poisoning, that the rat, if it moves, it's going to possibly go into another home which has not been infected before. All right. And the report comes to all kinds of very interesting conclusions, such as the fact that the reason why, for example, the fatality rate might have been higher in places like the Punjab, is because in the Punjab, farmers were much more likely to sleep alongside their animals. And the rats were much more likely to be in barns. But if you move to homes in Calcutta, the evidence seems to point out on the outskirts where people were keeping animals, but the sheds where they were kept were at a remote distance relatively from the main dwelling, that there the rate of infection was substantially lower. But one of the reasons why this article is enormously interesting, it also gets into the religious worldview of the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Parsis. So, for example, it points out that Muslims hate dogs. Okay, the Prophet apparently didn't like dogs. All right, and I'm not going to obviously get into that and into merits of that view, or whether there is evidence from the Hadiths or the Quran and all of that. But what does point out is that, look, actually Muslims are relatively fond of cats. So it suggests that the infection rate among Muslims is considerably lower than it is among Hindus. And it points out that one of the problems with the Hindus, and I'll quote it and you'll see exactly what I mean. It says, among the Hindus, the rat is the means of locomotion of the god Ganpati, right? It's his vehicle, right? Okay. And many of them would prefer to run the risk of taking plague rather than kill a cat. The Jains object to taking life of any kind. And then it suggests that, well, that may be one reason why the fatality rate in portions of Gujarat, particularly where you have a higher Jain population, is higher. All right. And this is what I mean. I mean, we don't have the luxury of being able to, as I don't have the luxury of being able to go over the whole article in substantial detail with you, but this is what I mean by the colonial sociology of knowledge. There are all kinds of assumptions about Indian society, about the structure of Indian religions, about the relationship of religiosity to everyday life, and so on. All right. And he was, by the way, not the only person by any means to write on this. There is another person who writes a whole series of articles, about 10 or 15 articles, where he did methodical work over a period of several months, looking at the role of cats in the prevention of bubonic plague. All right. So now let me go back to the question. So why was 1918-20 pandemic, the influenza, forgotten, notwithstanding the enormous loss of life? David Arnold suggests the following. He says that plague was long remembered. So he's referring to the 1896 now, right? 1896 bubonic plague. Perhaps more for the draconian government measures and the upsurge of national resentment it created than for the disease itself. In 1897, by the way, late 1897, 1898, the government, particularly after the assassination of Rand and the huge upsurge of unrest, decided that they were going to withdraw most of the measures of the Epidemic Diseases Act, and the search parties also ceased. All right. But the Great Flu epidemic, Arnold continues, hardly gets remembered at all. We can imagine the suffering of a few, but when we talk of 10 to 12 million deaths, it is hard to begin to imagine what that means. How do 6 million deaths differ from 12 million? It is a problem of numbers. Okay, and how far will human empathy stretch, right? And I would recall what to your minds that phrase from T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets from Bert Norton, where he says, humankind cannot bear very much reality, right? Now, there is a politics of numbers, certainly, right? I mean, you remember what that aphorism attributed to Joseph Stalin, and it is immaterial whether it's apocryphal or not, because I can clearly envision Stalin believing in something like that, even if he didn't say it. And that aphorism is where he says the death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. Right? We just, if you kill millions, you're going to get away with it. If you kill one person, you might get hooked. You might get cornered. All right, okay. But it can't simply be, I think, a question of numbers, because if you look at the bubonic plague, all right, so the influenza killed perhaps 15 to 20 million. The bubonic plague of 1896 killed 10 to 12 million. I mean, we're talking about massive numbers in either case. One gets remembered, the other doesn't. So I don't think that's a fully satisfactory answer. So we may have to turn to something else, right? Now, the influenza epidemic of 1918 arrived on India's shores as the Great War, as it's called, a politics to that designation, was drawing to a close. Right? Only a few months were left. Later in 1918, at the end of the war, you would have the Rowlatt Committee, appointed to investigate into revolutionary and terrorist conspiracies in India. And nationalist activity was going to pick up. I mean, remember that late March of 1919, Gandhi is going to issue a call for a national day of prayer and fasting, and then just weeks later, you're going to have the Jallianwala Bagh. You're going to have the incident of the Crawling Lane. You're going to have the Punjab disturbances. Now, you could say that all of this had diverted the attention of the nation. Nationalism was on the upsurge, right? But even this is not fully satisfying. It's not fully satisfying because one would think, as an explanation for why it hasn't been remembered, because one would think that logically the nationalists would want to draw attention to what had happened as in the influenza of 1918-19 as an illustration of the gross negligence on the part of the Indian state, right? Because, of course, if nationalism is an argument for self-determination and saying that the colonial state is not attentive to the needs of its subjects of Indians here, well, this would be an illustration of that. I mean, and you could make much the same argument apropos of the coronavirus. I mean, that yes, I mean, the spread of it in the United States, I mean, particularly, right, it has to do in part with obviously people taking things into their own hands, with having enormous decentralization where one mayor and one town, in the same state might say very different things. Obviously, it has to do with failures of leadership on the part of Trump and the White House, needless to say, but it has to go beyond that. There is a notion of personal culpability in some cases as well that we really have to think about, right? So the gist of it is that even if one accounts for a number of different considerations, the fact remains that the state was grossly inattentive. And one would think that the nationalists would actually pick on that. So it doesn't really, to me, it's not convincing to say that nationalism, in a sense, was really what was on the minds of people just at this particular juncture, and this pandemic then gets forgotten. Now, it may be, to move to a different kind of argument, it may be that the war years accompanied by food shortages, inflation, labor unrest, and of course an armed anti-colonial activity had already inured people, habituated them, acclimatized them to suffering. And I've already alerted you, of course, in substantial detail to what happened in the Bubonic Plague in 1896. But I want to suggest at this juncture, and this is where I bring famines, I want to suggest at this juncture that we need to think of it in a somewhat different framework. 50 years ago, the scholar Ira Klein wrote an article in the Journal of Asian Studies called Death in India, 1871 to 1921. That's what the article is called, Death in India, 1871 to 1921, where he says that those 50 years were a period of unprecedented calamity for Indians. So besides the bubonic plague and besides the flu, you have a whole series of famines, and you have the multiple scourges of cholera, malaria, smallpox, number of cholera epidemics, smallpox, right? And if you're looking at the timeline of famines, just to mention the major famines that we're really speaking about, post 1857-58 rebellion. So 1860-61, you have a famine in the upper Doab, in the Delhi, Agra, Hisar, that area. About 2 million people die of that. 1865-67, you have one in eastern India, in Orissa, in some portions of Madras and most of Bihar. We're talking about a casualty of about 4.5 to 5 million, including at least 1 million in Orissa. 1868-70, Rajputana, princely states, however, largely 1.5 million. And then the massive famines of the last quarter of the 19th century, 1876-78, Madras and Bombay, 5.5 million. And this is not including the native states. And this is the minimum. Now, Mike Davis, who is not a specialist, by the way, on India and Indian history, has nonetheless written what is the most gripping account in my view. The most gripping account. I think some of the contemporary accounts are very gripping. If you Digby's work, for example, but if you're looking at secondary scholarship, Mike Davis's book, Late Victorian Holocaust, where he has, close to 100, 125, 150 pages on the famines, I think are very gripping, and he uses a wide array of sources, not just state documents, but lots of newspapers as well, for example, and obviously secondary work, largely work emanating more from what we might describe as left historians, given Mike Davis's own predilections, intellectual predilections. But I think that he has offered a very extraordinary account of what was really happening, and looking at it within the global framework, because he has chapters on China and Brazil. And in that sense, it makes for an extraordinarily interesting study if you're looking at comparisons with the coronavirus today. All right. 1896-97, another famine in largely eastern India, but moving into portions of UP as well, Madras, Bengal, UP, some central provinces, and some portions of the Punjab. The estimates vary from 5 to 16 million of the number of people who were killed. If you look at the Davis book, pages 151 onwards, 151 to about 158, he has a discussion of some of the demography of that as well. And then just a few years later, 1899, 1900, Bombay, the central provinces, Berar, the unassigned province districts of Hyderabad state, Ajmer, we're talking about 1.1 to 4.5 million people killed. This is estimates from that time. The new estimates at a minimum are 3 to 10 million. All right. Now, I will not discuss the politics of the famines. I have extensive notes, and I really wanted to, but I think that I want to leave some time for the Q&A. So I want to, in closing, to that question, okay, and want to add one last big consideration, okay. Before I do that, so could we then say that, might we argue that given what happened in the last quarter of the 19th century, famine deaths, cholera, tuberculosis, smallpox, all right, all of which you could designate as excess death, okay, all right, we're not even looking at things like malnutrition and all of that, right? Because when we speak about famine, we're really speaking about starvation deaths, so in a short period of time, right? Might we argue that what historians have characterized as the pandemic of 1918-20 was experienced by most Indians as something much less than that? That it wasn't a pandemic at all for them. For them, it was just another chapter in the sordid saga of death, and one that was scarcely worth recording. Because 1896 is recorded. It's recorded by the state. It's recorded by photographers. Right? But the state doesn't record 1918. We don't have a visual archive. Yes, we have, everyone refers to one literary text, where there's a little description of bodies floating in the Ganga, but we don't really have anything to go by for the most part. So here's the one final consideration, which is best hinted at by taking a brief look at the work of the highly influential historian, the late C.A. Bailey, Chris Bailey, and in particular his book, The Birth of the Modern World, 1780 to 1914, which was published by Basil Blackwell in 2004. Now, Bailey is, of course, aware of the role of disease and epidemics in history. In the period 1780 to 1820, that short period of about 30, 40 years, he says, and I quote, in parts of the Pacific, the importance of Eurasian diseases by soldiers, seamen, and entrepreneurs scattered far and wide by the World War led to a staggering rate of mortality, which wiped out half the population. All right. So he's aware of what epidemic diseases obviously do. Now, there is no mention of the Bombay plague, but this is not a book on India, so he can be forgiven for that because you're speaking about 10, 12 million. So what is 10, 12 million? People dying. And when you're speaking really about monumental issues and the birth of the modern world, because what is the subject of the book? The book of the what, and the question is, what is the politics of his periodization? Right? Because this period he's looking at, 1718 to 1914, is when the modern world, as the title suggests, came into being. This is when you have new technologies of the state or governmentality. This is when what we might call the administrative state is really born. Of course, one can argue that differently. You read Corrigan and Sayre, The Great Arch, where they say that in the 13th century in England, already you had the rudiments of what you might call the birth of the administrative state. But I think the modern administrative state, and most of the world, you can say, dates back to this period that Bailey is really talking about. This was a period that was a heyday of colonialism, the modern world system. The Industrial Revolution transforms agriculture, industry. The face of Europe and the United States is going to be transformed. It's the period of revolutions, not just the French Revolution, but the most significant revolution in many respects in world history, the Haitian Revolution, which brings into being the first free Black republic in the world. Right? This is the period of Taylorism, when you move to the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and assembly line production. And the conquest of many, though not all, diseases. Right? This is when it's towards the end of this period that the germ theory will begin to replace the miasma theory. Okay? Or how diseases, influenza, for example, spreads. Right? And remember that it is in 1909 that Paul Ehrlich discovered a chemical which was an effective treatment for syphilis, and this becomes the first antibiotic, 1909. All right? Although he himself, by the way, called it actually chemotherapy, the use of a chemical to treat a disease. Chemotherapy is used to refer to treatment, a certain kind of treatment for cancer, usually, right? And this is a time when anesthesia, just at the cusp, right, about 1900, 1910, when anesthesia, the use of anesthesia comes into place for surgeries. They did use other things before. They used opium, they used chloroform, nitrous oxide, cocaine. But the first comprehensive textbook on anesthesia is published in 1912, right? Just before the end of the period that Bailey characterizes at 1780 to 1914, right? So what is the significance of this? The significance is this is what I would like you to think about, and I would like to conclude with this thought, that you see, 4 years after Bailey's end time, the Spanish influenza arrives. Now the influenza of 1918, and it causes an enormous mortality throughout the world. Okay? The significance is this, that the greatest conceit we have, and in a sense, it's the conceit which is the underlying theme of the book. The greatest conceit we have is that we are modern. And that if we are modern, it means we have conquered disease. This was actually the fundamental meaning of being modern in many ways. You can talk about the birth of subjectivity, all of that. But it's this idea that, well, plague, this is a medieval term. This is what happened in the 14th century. What do we have to do with something called plagues? What do we have anything to do with something called epidemics? Right? And I think that the greatest instantiation of this conceit of being modern, that we are modern, is this idea that we have conquered these kinds of diseases. And I think this is the real awakening, the real root shock that once again we are getting now, as we did in 1918. In other words, that particular framework that Bailey has, where you end the narrative, the birth of the modern, now the modern is an accomplished story. We would have to essentially revisit that whole narrative as well. Because what the pandemic today does is it once again unseats this conceit. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very impressive and very interesting lecture. I think this topic was very important to understand the historical context of it because of this ongoing pandemic that we are in between of. And we have to understand what lessons we have to learn from it in the present time. The first question would be that the containment of epidemic do not entirely depend on the government's response to it. It also involves the participation of the people. And so, do we get any accounts on the society's response? How did they respond to the pandemic, to the epidemics and the plague, and even, the bubonic plague?
Yeah. Yeah. For 1918, the short answer is we don't. We really don't. The record is so thin. It's extraordinary how thin the record is. We don't really have much of it. We know that I refer to it. We know that social distancing was what we today call social distancing. They spoke about distancing even then. I don't think they called it social distancing. And you know that there is an objection to the use of this, particularly in the Indian context. The implications can be quite hazardous. When you already have a large number of people who are being distanced from your worldview and you don't even want to get anywhere close to them. I mean, how many of the domestics who work for people who are middle class families even sit at the dining table? Ever? Never. Right? I mean, we all know that scenario. I don't have to go over that, right? So given the common sense reading of caste and the caste system and its implications, we know what some of the hazardous implications of social distancing, which is one reason why a number of intellectuals back in April wrote a letter to Modi pointing out that the government should never use that phrase at all, that maybe they should only use physical distancing. But going back to your question, 1918, there is very sketchy that distancing was observed. Okay. But it was not so much as a matter of state protocol, because what I've pointed out in 1918, the state is actually nowhere to be seen. That is what is really remarkable, as opposed to 1896. Okay, 1896, 97, we're speaking about a very different story. Remember, the Epidemic Diseases Act is early February 1897. There's no such act passed in 1918, of course, right? Okay, in fact, the government took the lesson that you don't want to intrude into people's lives too much. And this is one reason why it was decided that it was not even going to actually bring the 1897 Act into operation. All right. When you go back to 1896, 97, again, there we have a richer record, but we don't have enough of a record. We do have some of it, very little of it. We don't have enough of a record as to which would indicate how Indians were reacting. So what we have to do is we have to read letters that were written to the Times of India, for example. That's one of the newspapers that you can look at, which is widely available. I mean, I've only started looking at all of this about 3 months ago. So it may well be the case that, for example, the Hindu, but the Hindu is not available on ProQuest, and I don't have access to our digital archive. It may be that maybe in the Hindu there were letters as well. It's only when I have access at some point when things open up, let's say in India, either at the Hindu library or at Teen Murti or somewhere, that one might be able to look at a number of other Indian newspapers. But certainly if you look at the Times of India, which I have looked at, and I've looked at letters, people were well aware of the fact that you should actually practice distancing. And some letters refer to the 14th century, astonishingly enough. Okay, so there was some awareness of what had happened during what is called the Black Death, where the idea of quarantine first comes in. The idea of isolation, social isolation, and quarantine comes in. But the question that you're asking, I think the gist of it is very pertinent, because your suggestion and the question is that this cannot simply be a mandate which comes from the top down. It cannot simply be a mandate of the state. I mean, that's one of the things we're finding in the United States, that the president or the governor may say this or that, but then people simply decide they're going to decide on their own. And I don't want to enter into that question with respect to the U.S., because I have written on this quite extensively, and I'm writing on this in my book on the coronavirus, which I'm finishing up now. That there is a long history of dissent against state mandated actions of this kind in this country. But I think in India, if we shift the focus back to India, I think the suggestion that the participation of people, their willingness to enter into it, is an important consideration. But then you have to go back to the point I started with when I replied to you, namely that, well, we'll have to think through it very carefully, because I think you will agree with me, whatever other views you might have, you will agree with me, as I suspect most people who are listening will agree, that in India, there's already a large number of people that the middle class, for example, or the upper caste, do not want to actually have any kind of relationship or proximity to. They don't want to begin with. Okay, so and here I'm not even looking at a very rudimentary aspect, which a number of commentators have pointed out. The point would not be unique to me at all, and that rudimentary aspect is, how do you observe social distancing in 90% of the cases in India, when you're talking about slums, when you're talking about small apartments where 10 people are sharing an apartment, etc., etc. The similar problems for the working class in the US, which is one reason why the fatality rate for Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans is substantially higher than it is for white people. And when you adjust it for age, it is 5 times higher. 5 times higher. Because if you're looking at how many square feet one Black person has in a residence to himself or herself in comparison to a white person, who uses public transportation? Right? Black people.
Yeah.
Right? All of these considerations would come into play in India as well. And sometimes in a different way, but they would come into play. Yeah.
You mentioned David Arnold in your lecture,
Yeah.
and it has been propounded by scholars like David Arnold and Michael Foucault that under the colonial rule, medicine and health policies too had become a tool to colonize the society
Yeah.
and land and just the body. How do you
Yeah.
see this comment?
Yeah, look, I mean, there is a very substantial literature on this kind of notion of biopolitics. Okay, I mean, it is not only Foucault's book on obviously things like madness and the prison, but the history of sexuality. In fact, actually, the idea of governmentality really makes its first appearance, frankly, in this way. In volume 1 of the history of sexuality. In general, I would agree with those kinds of observations that have come out of that. Okay, because you see, go back to the idea of social distancing. What are the philosophical implications? Because what is Foucault arguing? See, what Foucault is arguing is that beginning in the late 18th century, we moved to regimes of self-surveillance. Okay? We kill by kindness. Let me use that phrase as a provocation. We kill by kindness. Okay? And this particular ethos of what I'm going to call management of social issues, which is, by the way, exactly what's happening with the racial issue in America today. Exactly. all the corporations coming on board, it doesn't mean anything at all except and all the universities giving out statements of we support black lives and this and that, just as a matter of ritual protocol. This is what I'm calling the management of racial discourse now at the highest levels. This is one way to bury the problem for good, because what it simply means is you bring in new diversity managers who are now going to talk about race in a certain new language. That's what it really means. This began in the late 18th century, where we begin to survey ourselves. We don't need surveil ourselves. We don't need the state to do it. We become self-regulating mechanisms. Now, you could say that social distancing is really that. This is one reason why, even though my own personal politics is one of complete abhorrence for what Trump and the Republican Party in the US stand for, and what the BJP stands for as well in India, that in the US at least, I think some of the dissent has to be viewed in a slightly different register. Okay? It has to be viewed in a slightly different register, because we have to understand that some suspicion of the state is critical. It's important. I don't think it's possible to have a healthy society where you don't have a sufficient suspicion of the state. Okay? And I think that some of the dissent has emanated from that. But the whole question of biopolitics, I would have to give a much more full-blown answer. But all of these elements would have to be factored into the question that you had posed.
So this question is about the famine, the Great Bengal Famine of 1943-44.
Yeah,
That Dr. Shashi Tharoor has said that Churchill has as much blood as Hitler does,
yeah,
particularly the decisions he took, during the Great Bengal Famine. So
yeah,
how do you see this? Because the ships of grain were coming from Australia
yeah,
to Calcutta, docked in Calcutta, and
yeah,
were
yeah.
instructed not to disembark, but to send it to the UK to
Yes,
feed the
yes.
Britishers.
Yeah, yeah.
How do
Yeah,
you
look,
see this?
the Madhushri Mukherjee wrote a whole book on this. It's a book which some scholars think is a little bit extreme, but basically she holds Churchill responsible for what she calls genocide. I mean, she's very clear. And this whole argument which is an argument that she's not the first person to make that argument. That a number of people had made that argument that even while India was itself undergoing, Bengal was undergoing a famine, that there was an export of grains, food from India to places such as Australia and others where it was required for the use of Allied war troops, essentially. Okay, I would lean more on her side, but this would require a protracted discussion of Churchill as well and British policy. And since you have asked that question, I'm going to take the liberty of asking you to go back to that PowerPoint, because I had put out some slides. Of the rest of all the slides are actually a famine, and I want to make one point there, which is a different way to approach the whole issue of famine. It's not about 1943 so much, the point that I want to make, but it's about the discourse on famine, because I think the larger question behind what you're asking has to do with what kind of discourse do we generate about famine. So we're going to go through these very, very quickly, because I really want to get to what I would call the main point here about what it is that these images represent. This is from Digby's history. Digby wrote a whole book which was a devastating indictment of British policies and British rule. So the next slides after that. So these are all slides, by the way. These are images which have to do with the famines from 1877, and then later on 1898 and 1897, 98, and then the last famine of 1900. This is a family in the Deccan, 1877. Just keep on going on. I'll just read out the captions. Just look at the images very quickly. They're gruesome, some of them, obviously. Some of the images that we're really talking about. The caption here says that those who get to this stage rarely ever recovered. Okay, this is Famine Victims of 77. This is a map which you will find in the Mike Davis book, the subsequent map, and it shows which areas were severely affected and which areas were less severely affected. This is famine of 1896-97. Next one, please. And this image here is famine victims in Jabalpur, in now MP. Just look at the images over here, and look at the figures, and you'll see. I mean, it's basically all you're seeing is really bones here. This is during the visit of Lord Elgin in 1897, and this is in the central provinces, a young famine victim. Next image, please. And this image is a young boy who had actually been attacked by jackals, according to the caption. Okay, and next image. Can we have the next image? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
This is a 15-year-old girl. Next image, please. And this is sort of this is an image where you have the young children who are famine victims, and then the British self-image of themselves as kind of like the conqueror. And if we can look at the next image over here, which is villagers from Rajputana. This is 1899. I apologize for the poor quality of but they're taken from a book, and I wasn't able to get a good scanner at the last minute, obviously. Next image, please. You'll see the point of this in just a moment. If we can just skip over this one, next one. And this is the caption here, by the way, when it was published in a magazine, it said the Gujarati is a soft man. Okay, so you can think about that yourself, reflect on it. And this is from 1897. And this is burning plague victims in Bombay in 1898. And the next image that you see here, by the way, so this, Ishan, goes back to the question, next image, goes back to the question that when you are in the midst in between famines, look at what happens. Wheat exports from the central provinces in terms of millions of rupees, 1881 to 1886, a substantial increase. A substantial increase. So this is not simply something that happened in the Bengal famine. Then in 1886 to 1901, 16.6 million rupees once again. All right. Okay, and then the next image. So this is again from the famine of 1899. Next image. All right, now the images you're seeing now, and you'll see the point I'm going to make now. Okay, these are drawn from London News. The Illustrated London News was a mass circulation periodical. And these are all from 1874 to 1877. Okay, now remember what I had mentioned to you. What I had mentioned to you was a number of famines, and one of the principal famines that I talked about was 1876, Madras and Bombay. But you had those are the biggest famines. You have smaller famines where the casualties may be a few 100,000. This image and the next 5-6 images were trying to do, they were trying to project the idea of village India as a kind of an Arcadian pleasure ground. Okay, life is going on as normal. You have the woman with the matka, all right. You look at this woman with the child. I mean, the woman looks well fed. The child looks almost plump. So this is actually, these are all from the Illustrated London News. This is a bania, that's what the caption says, or a grain seller. Okay, and it says, the caption says the impending famine in this case. Okay, and then in this next image over here, The famine in India, it shows bullock carts carrying grain. See, what your reader in London or elsewhere in Great Britain was thinking to himself or herself was life in India goes on as normal. There's a rural countryside, leisurely pace, bullock carts, human beings inhabit the landscape. Under British rule, things look peaceful, idyllic, right? You have to contrast these with the images that you saw before. Okay, and this is from the graphic. This is a double spread, so this was a very large print, centerfold. Okay, the centerfold, famine and distribution of relief to the sufferers. So my bab, the British are the my bab. You have a family, they come, they're bowing their hands, and the British are dispensing foods. They're dispensing justice effectively, right? That's what the image was that was being projected. So I think that, Ishan, going back to your question, where do I stand on that particular issue? I mean, it's a long subject for discussion because we'd have to look at some of the particulars of the debate about the 1943. But I think, yes, there is no question there is British culpability. As I said, I'm more on her side. Amartya Sen, who has written on that, had something of a critique where he thought that there was some element of exaggeration, particularly the role of Churchill, because is this falling back on sort of like the great man theory of history? One man decided the whole fate and fortune. Were there free market, for example, if you go back to the famines of the late 19th century, the last quarter of the 20th century, what is one of Mike Davis's fundamental arguments? One of the fundamental arguments is that basically it is the use of free market policies. Okay, the idea that you don't want to regulate anything because the free market will be able to adjudicate this issue, as it were. Okay, and people like Richard Temple, who is a person who has been discussed extensively, particularly in relationship to the famine of 1876. That Richard Temple was someone who more or less subscribed to the kind of views that Adam Smith had mentioned in The Wealth of Nations about how do you address the problem of famine. All right. So I think we would have to look at those sets of issues. Yeah.
So, how relevant were such notions as the rights of the people to subsistence? What were the obligations of the rulers to guarantee subsistence in times of need? In short, was there a moral economy in India? And if there was, what happened to it?
Oh, I mean that's a very large question, but the simple answer is no. I think that I think that the idea of the moral economy, as E.P. Thompson had really talked about it in The Making of the English Working Class. I mean, the fundamental argument again, but you have to remember that this is coming from a school of historians that I agree with, but the fundamental argument there has to do with the fact that once you have the Industrial Revolution in places like Britain, it really led also to the collapse of the moral economy. It's not as though that the pre-industrial revolution past was no there was no class conflict or anything of that kind. Obviously, that's not the view that Thompson has. But what he's saying is that such things as self-aggrandizement and greed reach absolutely new levels. And this means that this idea that you are responsible to some degree for the welfare of others in your own community, you put a restraint on your own behavior. I think that the argument is disappeared. And I think, I mean, you're seeing that in India, of course, where I think the rich have completely absolved themselves, completely. Although I must say that one of the few pleasant things about what's been happening in the last 3-4 months is, and those of you who are in India and been following events very carefully, I think you follow them as I do, which is that you can't really go out very much. That you look at the internet, you read the newspapers, you talk to people, but perhaps you have a different perspective. But I think at least there have been a large number of activists and NGOs who have tried to step in with food aid in particular. Which is why I don't think that we're seeing massive, starvation right now, as we might have. But I would say, on the whole, if you look at the middle class and the rich, I think they have completely absolved themselves of any responsibility at all. They opted out, except to get subsidies from the state. They opted out of the state, when neoliberalization policies started in India, roughly 2.5, 3 decades ago. So, is there any concept of moral economy left? Answer is no. I don't really think so. And I don't think certainly that the Indian state has done anything that can be called remotely sufficient in this particular case. We know what measures were taken, and we know what percentage of the GDP has been assigned, as a relief package. And that one of the critiques that has been made is that a large proportion of that had already been assigned in the ordinary budget. So certainly, if you're looking at the kind of relief packages that had been passed in some of the social welfare states in Europe, what we've done in India is a fraction of that. Yeah.
So we'll quickly take two last questions from the audience. This is one
Yeah.
by Radhika Chadha, that would you like to comment on Prashant Kidambi's work on the plague in Bombay? And
Look, I read that. That's not something I've read recently, because that work was published some years ago. In fact, I remember meeting him very briefly about 4 or 5 years ago, having a short discussion of that. So my answer to that is no. I really can't, because I'd have to revisit that work much more carefully now, which I haven't done, but I'm aware of that work. Yeah.
and this question is by Om Tiwari, that was these pandemics, especially the bubonic plague of 1890s, had some sort of bearing on the revival of Indian system of medicine like Ayurveda, Unani, and etc.
Well, yes, I think that there is some evidence for that. So initially the state was completely reluctant to allow indigenous medical systems to weigh in on this, because the general view was that this is all basically humbug. Yeah, these are not really trained doctors. They don't understand the concept of modern medicine. They're all quacks, basically. That was essentially the quackery, is what it is. That was really the view. But when, after the resistance to the Epidemic Diseases Act, and particularly when it led to such things as the search parties and then the assassination of Rand, and political unrest, what the government decided to do was to step back. And one of the consequences of stepping back was freeing up the space for Ayurveda, Unani. All right, it freed up that space, and it's just shortly after that Hakim Ajmal Khan, after whom the road is named in Delhi, Ajmal Khan Road, right? That people like him start to really become quite important. And we have to remember that Gandhi, who had a deep suspicion of modern medicine, because he saw it as fundamentally vivisectionist, and he also saw it as a profit-making machine. He had a much more sympathetic view of the profession of nursing, although he did not follow the textbook principles of nursing necessarily, but he was much more sympathetic to nursing as a nurse himself. And we have to remember that Gandhi actually inaugurated Tibia College. He gave the inaugural speech at that college, and that speech is recorded in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. It's an extraordinary speech, and he did so partly because by that time, Unani, Ayurveda, and homeopathy as well, which is not indigenous, of course, although now most of us think of it as purely indigenous, because homeopathy comes from Germany, but it became much more widely used in India. And most people are not aware of the fact that circa 1900, it was the most widely system used of medicine in the United States, before the American Medical Association drove it completely underground. There's a wonderful book by Paul Starr on the professionalization of American medicine, and how all the homeopathic doctors were completely rubbished by the medical association and by the pharmaceutical industry, because they realized that there's no money to be made, comparatively speaking, in homeopathy as opposed to allopathic medicine. So The answer to that question is yes. I think that if one is looking at the revival of indigenous medical practices and systems, I think the late 1897 is the turning point for that. Yeah.
So thank you, Professor Lal, for this wonderful lecture and this wonderful conversation. It was highly, uh, insightful and very detailed, and it gave us an idea of how plague and epidemics were tackled in history and how we are tackling it right now, what we can learn and what we should learn at this time. So
My pleasure.
to yeah, to end this, I think I should say what Yuval Harari has recently remarked, that many short-term emergency measures will become a fixture of life. That is the nature of emergencies. They fast forward historical processes. In the journey of fighting a pandemic, the government have to learn a lesson from our colonial predecessors, that the government cannot leave behind any group, especially the backward sections of our society, in the fight. So thank you very much, sir, and it was truly an honor to host you this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye bye.